Kia ora and welcome. In this video, I'm going to cover off allergies and food allergies, particularly when it comes to customers who might come into your food business like a cafe or restaurant and require a special dietary requirement. In Australia and New Zealand, we have 11 main food allergies on our list and regulatory requirements. So for example, gluten, shellfish, wheat, eggs, seafood, sulfites, sesame seeds, seafood like fish, for example, lupins, soy, and tree nuts, and of course, peanuts. If you're watching this video from North America, for example, you've only got 8 of these allergens on your list. If you're joining me and watching this video from Europe, like the UK, for example, you might have additional allergens on your list. For example, celeriac, for example, mustard seeds. If you're joining me from Asia or countries like Japan, you might have a few more allergens than what's on this list. So in Japan, for example, we've got kiwi fruit on the list. We might have banana on the list, and a few more allergens like buckwheat, for example, also on the allergen list. But it's really important to understand that if you've got any of these allergens in food, you let customers know. If you are a food manufacturing company, as in you're retailing outside the production area, you need to have a label, and your label needs to state what are the ingredients and what are the main food allergens within the product. If you are serving the food from a cafe or restaurant or, for example, a retail shop, there's no expectation for you to label. However, you do need to maintain something called an allergen list. So this is an example of all your menu items that are itemized, a list of all the ingredients, and a list of all the allergens within each of your menu items. You might perhaps want to laminate this sheet and then have it on hand if a customer comes and asks you a question, or one of the service staff a question about the allergens in the food. So when it comes to food allergies, what is a food allergy? So allergies generally are triggered by immune responses. So the food goes down into our stomach, and we've got things called mast cells in our body. The job of a mast cell is to attack anything that's bad for you. We don't know why with some people. Basically, their immune system will attack the food and produce a histamine chemical within the stomach, within the bloodstream, that gives you the symptoms such as the rash, the hives, the swelling, etc. In a severe case of a food allergy, the customer might have something called an anaphylactic reaction, where the histamine levels might spike and they could collapse within about 3 to 4 minutes. So that's quite disconcerting. When it comes to food intolerances, you might have a customer with a lactose intolerance, for example. So lactose is a simple sugar in milk. We digest the sugar using an enzyme called lactase. If the customer lacks this enzyme, they can't digest the sugar. So essentially they'll have stomach or digestive problems. So they'll have stomach cramping, bloating, diarrhea, those kinds of symptoms. So if you are working in food, working in retail or service of food, you won't necessarily see the customer go into a reaction. But when they go home, they'll have severe pain, severe cramping, diarrhea, those sort of symptoms. So we'll always treat a customer with a food intolerance just as seriously as a customer with a food allergy. When it comes to intolerances, another special dietary requirement is a customer who might suffer from gluten. So what is gluten? Gluten is a protein that we get in things like wheat, barley, rye, oats, and triticale, which is a combination of both wheat and rye. So essentially what happens is when the food goes down, gluten which is nothing but this stringy, stretchy, chewing gum textured product, as you can see here, gives structure to the bread. It gives structure to the cake, for example. It makes cakes and bread spongy. So essentially, they trap the air bubbles. When we take gluten out of food, you lose this spongy textured product because obviously the gluten helps trap the air bubbles. But what happens when a customer has gluten? So essentially, if gluten like this goes into our stomach, most people don't necessarily digest gluten fully. There's a little bit of digestion that happens in the stomach, and then of course it goes into the large intestine, which further breaks down into gliadin and glutenin. But essentially the proteins don't really break down that much. Essentially most people just dispose of the gluten through their digestive tract. But with some people, when gluten goes into the small intestine, so imagine you've got a cross section of the small intestine. Within the small intestine, we've got things called villi. Think about villi as like spaghetti within the small intestine. The job of these villi is to absorb any nutrition from food. When gluten goes into the small intestine, it damages these villi. And essentially, with people who've got severe allergies and severe intolerance to gluten or celiac disease, basically you've got these villi. They are terribly damaged, and they're damaged all the way to the cell lining. So there's blood, there's severe pain, cramping, and even small quantities of gluten can trigger very severe pain in the customer. So it's really important, if you do have a customer, that we minimize this risk with total separation. So we've got good labeling, good training around allergens, and total separation. As I mentioned earlier, a separate chopping board, for example, a separate toaster altogether. If you don't have a separate toaster, you'll want to sandwich the bread within some baking paper when you are toasting it. Basically, you don't want contact between the product and the surface that has come in contact with gluten. So that's an example of the different food allergies and different food intolerances that you might come across in a basic cafe, restaurant, food production environment.